Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. Thank you all for joining us. I think we might want to allow a moment for everybody. I can see the numbers are ticking up as participants join, so I'm just going to allow a minute to make sure that everyone's online. We almost need some sort of sign I can hold up so I don't have to keep saying to all the new people joining that this is what we're doing. But yeah, let's see, there's 30 people here now, but we're expecting quite a lot more. Okay, seems to have stalled a little bit, but I think I'm going to kick off because we're quite tight for time given that this is only an hour. So I'm Kerry McCarthy, I'm a Labour MP and I'm a shadow transport minister. I mostly cover the decarbonisation agenda, also got the roads brief, the active travel brief and some of the fallout from Brexit stuff. I'm also the only female minister in the shadow transport team. I think transport does tend to be quite a boys' world, particularly when you get into some of the more Anaraki discussions about rail and buses. But it's really good that the Women's Budget Group is working with the Women's Environmental Network on this report today. We are here today to launch the Inclusive and Green Transport paper that's been published by the Women's Budget Group. And this is part of a project, as I said, with the Women's Environmental Network to develop a feminist Green New Deal. So to encourage groups working on the environment to consider gender issues as part of their environmental work, but also the other way around, women's organisations to engage with the climate emergency. And it is really important as we plan policies on the Green New Deal that we recognise the needs of both planet and people. But as I said, this can quite often be a boys' world and we don't always consider gender inequalities where we should. So today we will be very much discussing that. Before I introduce the three speakers, the all-important hashtag is Green Caring Economy. So if you are using social media, please use that. You can post questions in the Q&A box and please feel free to introduce yourself and ideally say which organisation you come from if it is an organisation, or a little bit about yourself in the chat box. And can I please ask you to please be respectful of others in terms of the chat that you have. So without further ado, our speakers are Tiffany Lamb, who is the independent consultant that has authored this report, was asked by the Women's Budget Group to do that. We've then got Jemima Hartshorn, the founder of Mums for Lungs, and then Emma Holland-Lindsay, who's the head of public affairs at the National Federation of Women's Institutes. So if I can firstly ask Tiffany, she's going to give a 10-minute overview of the paper that is being launched today, and she's got some slides. So over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks, Kerry. I'm really happy to talk through key findings from the paper today. So the starting point of the paper on inclusive and sustainable transport systems is that our ability to travel and where, when, how, and why we do it is countered by power and privilege. This means it's really important to ask and understand by whom, and for what do our transport systems serve. And gender and other disparities along racial and class lines, for example, there are gender disparities and other disparities in how we travel, which underscore the need for inclusive and sustainable transport systems, which are important not only to decarbonise transport, but also to democratise the right to safe mobility. The paper is structured around 4 themes: access to economic resources and free time, car-centric policy and planning, safety and accessibility, and the technocratic paradigm in transport. And I'll go over key findings across these themes before wrapping up with recommendations. So in terms of access to economic resources and free time, there are factors that create gender differences in urban and just general transport patterns, like the gender division of household labor and care, women's lower rates of participation in the labor market, and gender discrimination in the labor market. So we know that women are more likely than men to have lower incomes, be in part-time and/or precarious work, and live in poverty. We know that compared to men, women make more frequent but short distance journeys throughout the day rather than longer but less frequent journeys during peak hours. And women make disproportionately more care-related journeys, which can often be encumbered because they're carrying things or transporting other people. And these journeys may require multiple stops. And this is supported with evidence, like in the UK, men are twice as likely as women to make commutes lasting at least an hour, whereas women make the majority of trips lasting less than 15 minutes. We also know that in England in 2019, and this is consistent with previous years as well, men make fewer overall trips, but they travel farther. Men also make more commuting trips and business trips than women. But the problem is that transport systems are built to optimize long distance radio journeys into city centers during peak hours. So this does not really provide for care-related journeys, and it really disadvantages women, children, teenagers, older people, informal workers, and workers with more varied journeys who don't have that typical peak hour commute. And even before the pandemic, traveling to work, that work commute did not make up the majority of overall travel. In England, the three most common trip purposes from 2002 to 2019 have been leisure, shopping, and commuting. So this raises a question around why radio transport planning is the norm when it doesn't really reflect the types of journeys that people make. And with public transport, women overall are more reliant on walking in public transport than are men, but there are gender differences in how public transport is used. So in the UK, women are more reliant on buses, while men are more reliant on trains and tubes. And this means that women have been disproportionately disadvantaged by bus deregulation and subsequent cuts to local bus services under austerity. And cuts to bus services have intersected with cuts to other important social services and public services like refuges and childcare and access to support for domestic violence survivors. Now moving on to car-centric policy and planning, a lot of the way, so this is bigger than transport planning and policy, it has to do with wider land use planning, which has really built in car dependency in lots of the UK outside of London. So over 1 million people in the southwest and northeast of England live in transport deserts, where the only form of transport that's feasible is driving, because there are no pavements, there's no cycling infrastructure, and there's no public transport. But despite this built-in car dependency, access to a car is deeply unequal. So men are more likely to hold a driving license than women. Black people are over twice as likely as white people in England to live in a household without a car. And overall, lower income households are less likely to own a car. There are also inequalities in road safety. So despite lower levels of car ownership and usage among people with lower incomes, they are disproportionately harmed by road traffic collisions. So in areas of higher deprivation in the UK, not only are there more road collisions, but pedestrians are at higher risk of road traffic injuries. And children, especially males in the most deprived areas in England, are at the highest risk of road traffic injury across all modes of transport. There are also socioeconomic inequalities in exposure to traffic-related air pollution, where households in poverty experience the most traffic-related air pollution exposure. And in England, air pollution is higher in deprived neighborhoods, but particularly those where over 20% of residents are people of color. And now moving on to safety and accessibility. In the UK, 86% of women aged 18 to 24 and 71% of women of all ages have experienced sexual harassment in public space, including on public transport. And 66% of girls in the UK have experienced sexual harassment in public, including on public transport, and adopt tactics to allegedly avoid it, like taking longer routes or pretending to be talking on the phone to someone or listening to music. And London has the highest rates of public sexual harassment in the UK. 40% of sexual assaults occur in public spaces, particularly on the public transport network. And 55% of women in London have experienced sexual harassment on public transport, mainly the tube. And it's really important to note that globally, fear of harassment and other safety concerns can lead women to drive or take a taxi instead of walking, cycling, or taking public transport. And it can even stop them from going out at all, especially at night. It's important to consider how our identity shapes our perceptions and experiences of safety. So as I just discussed, street harassment is a barrier to safe mobility for women and girls. For communities of color and immigrant communities, racism and hostile environment immigration policies are a barrier to safe mobility as well. Women's increased dependence on public transport and walking increases their vulnerability to gender-based violence in public space, since they spend more time waiting or walking in poorly lit and isolated places. Disabled women are also more reliant on public transport, but they often experience intrusive and non-consensual touching by passengers and staff. And it's important to consider not just safety from a passenger or user's perspective, but from the staff perspective as well. Staffing cuts under austerity have increased the vulnerability of public transport workers to gender-based violence on the job. And during the pandemic, there's been increased violence towards bus drivers. Identity also shapes accessibility. Nearly half of disabled people in England, Scotland, and Wales are completely dependent on public transport because they don't have a car. But a fifth of disabled people find public transport inaccessible due to inadequate or absent signage, staff to help them access services, wheelchair space, priority seating, and step-free access. And safety and accessibility concerns can increase disabled people's dependency on taxis, which can exacerbate socioeconomic deprivation. And the final theme is the technocratic paradigm in transport. So women represent only 14% of the built environment sector in the UK and 21% of the UK transport sector. People of ethnic minority backgrounds represent only 4% of the UK transport planning workforce. And this largely has to do with how transport is framed as a technical issue that requires engineering, economic, and technological skills and solutions. Those are all fields where women and people of color are underrepresented. And under this technocratic paradigm, which privileges technical considerations over social considerations, gender, diversity, and inclusion just don't seem relevant. So this not only produces a male bias in transport systems and top-down technology-driven solutions, but it also means that women who work in the transport sector are at greater risk of sex discrimination and just working in heavily male-dominated industries with macho cultures and more barriers to progression. So this paper concludes with 9 recommendations, which are to collect gender disaggregated data, adopt gender responsive budgeting in transport investments, increase gender responsive participatory planning, strengthen bus networks by increasing public ownership, prioritize active travel for care-related and local journeys, especially to key services, conduct gender safety audits and accessibility audits, invest in bystander intervention training, explicitly prioritize gender equity and inclusion, and conduct equality impact assessments, particularly in transport and land use planning and policy, and finally invest in mentoring programs to diversify the transport sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I think there was some really interesting stuff in that. And I think probably a lot of us knew it sort of on an anecdotal sort of personal experience level, but it's really good to have the statistics bear out what we know. And I think you're entirely right that we need to look less at the idea of it as a technical issue and something that very much involves people's lives. You know, I have lots of discussions about the technology and, you know, from electric vehicles, hydrogen, all the sorts of things that are coming along. But it's really important that we do actually reach out and talk about, you know, transport is such a fundamental part of people's lives. It's really important we have that discussion too. So probably a good note on which to introduce Jemima, who can tell us about the work that Mums for Lungs has done in trying to tackle air pollution in London. As typical, the bell's just gone off here, but ignore that. It doesn't mean I have to do anything. It's just to signal the next debate started. So over to Jemima and Child. I don't know if, I know Jemima did say that there might be a bit of an issue in terms of childcare. If it might be an idea to skip to, right, are you okay, Jemima, to go? Okay, you can just unmute yourself and yeah, interested.
Okay, thank you very much. So this feels a bit typical because my daughter, who was supposed to sleep, has just woken up this moment, but that shall not be a problem. I would like to go and speak about the work I do with Mums for Lungs, and we'll get straight into it. 1 second, please. Here we go. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I feel a bit like an imposter here, having seen the presentation just now, because my work is obviously much more community-based, much more grassroots-based, and not nearly as scientific or anything as the important work Tiffany does. But a lot of it does feel very true from our perspective as well. So basically, I started Mums for Lungs about 4 years ago when I was on maternity leave for the first time for a kid that is luckily not here right now, but in school. And the reason I got into campaigning is this. So I was reading about air pollution 6 months sort of into having a son. We were living in Brixton on a main road at the time. And I started reading that air pollution is just incredibly harmful to everyone's health. And it goes from pregnancy, where it can result in low birth rate. And I've heard about premature births after high pollution days in areas such as London. Children are much more likely to be developing asthma, have wheezing, coughs, slower development of lung function, even reduced lung capacity by the time they're 8 or 9 has been measured very clearly by Dr. Ian Mudway, who's an expert researcher at Imperial College. Adults are very strongly affected by air pollution as well. Lung cancer, diabetes, many illnesses are either contributed to or linked to air pollution at the levels that we see here in London. The elderly are very strongly affected as well. As you can see, asthma, lung cancer, dementia, things like that. This is a data set from 2018. Since then, there has been a lot more research into many other illnesses that can be closely linked to air pollution. And obviously there were discussions about the links and relationship between COVID-19 and air pollution as well. Anyway, I read about this, I thought about this. I am a human rights lawyer by training from Germany and have a bit of a background in campaigning on defence rights though, and I wanted to do something about it. So I started talking about it. Turns out there were quite a few mothers and actually other parents as well who were concerned about air pollution. And one of my friends coined the phrase saying we need to turn our anxiety into action. And for me, it was a bit more turn my anger into action. But that's what we started doing. We started Mums for Lungs and we met on a weekly basis at the beginning. There was as many parents as kids in the room and we took it from there. So what we do is we raise awareness, we campaign very pragmatically at all levels of government for solutions that are likely to reduce air pollution effectively, and where we think that we, as a voice of people who are brought together by their concern about air pollution for children in London and beyond, can have the biggest impact. We have now gone on to doing more things like bringing together other campaigners to have a stronger impact and show that there is many people out there who really strongly want to see effective leadership from government to address this public health emergency of air pollution. We empower others to campaign, and we do a lot of work around school streets as well. I will talk about this all in a sec, but basically the kids, like here, the boy who is in that picture, is the reason we campaign. And we hear about stories, often not as bad as him, luckily, but we hear about children who are affected by air pollution and adults who are affected by air pollution a lot regularly. There was a huge influx of people right sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, sort of, you know, where people were really feeling the impact of air pollution going down on London streets and how much better people were feeling. People who had not been aware that their migraines or their wheeziness was linked to air pollution were suddenly saying, oh, cars are off, I don't need to use my inhaler anymore. So in a bit more detail, the kind of stuff we do is we've been campaigning very strongly, for example, government to put strong and effective targets into the Environment Bill. I'll tell you that much. We have not succeeded to date. We have campaigned very strongly in the past for the ULEZ expansion to all of London, and we will continue to do so. But for the time being, we're excited that the ULEZ in London, the ultra low emission zone, will be expanded to the self-circular, and will mean that the most polluting cars will be charged to drive in that area. We have been campaigning a lot at council level, so we've been campaigning very strongly for them to introduce school streets, which is a scheme whereby through roads are closed to whereby through traffic is prevented from driving through roads near a school at drop-off and pick-up times, and which effectively increases the clean air and the road safety around schools while children are on the road. We've done campaigns with hundreds of parents across the country getting involved. You can see the posters down here, Cars Make Us Think Outside the Box. I think in July and September, each about 2,000 posters like these were hung up across the streets of London and other places, which was super exciting. We have flyers like a flyer against idling, and we've just started sending out a flyer raising awareness of the issues of wood burning, which really empowers people to you know, get involved in a little form of campaigning themselves by just handing out a flyer, just throwing it through a letterbox, sending it home in book bags. Things like that are really helpful to raise awareness, as well as sort of empower people to do a first step if they are frustrated about air pollution. We bring together campaigners. So for example, we've done Twitter Storm with over 1,000 people joining us about the Environment Bill as well, Vote Clean Air. And we've done letters and campaigns with other organisations. And we provide all the information and resources that parents might need to get started to campaign for a school street through our Facebook forum, through a film and things like that. On top of that, we do lots of other smaller campaigns. So we've been trying to get Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's and Asda to stop being involved in Logistics UK, which is a freight lobbying organisation that has been campaigning against clean air zones across the UK, and we're opposed to Silverstone Tunnel and have been supporting that campaign as well. So there's lots we do, and when I see this, I always feel a bit proud actually, because we are primarily a volunteer-led group. We have a bit of funding by now, but all our funding put together, all our staff time put together is significantly less than one full-time staff member. So that is, you know, I like to think we sort of do have an impact, especially for the size we are. But there are obviously massive challenges to seeing change. And when I started campaigning and learning about air pollution in 2017, I could not have I could not have imagined that it would be so difficult, because there are so many campaigners out there, and the government had just lost a case in court by Client Earth, against Client Earth, who said, look, many areas of the UK are illegally polluted. You need to clean up the air. This is illegal, right? And with my background as a human rights lawyer, I was sort of naive, but still sort of very trusting in the law to show its action and its teeth. But frankly, this is, 4 years ago, and a lot of the UK is still illegally polluted, and we are still waiting to see that action in the Environment Bill or in other policies in the funding that will show that government take it as serious as it is, considering it is an absolute public health emergency. So I think the challenges are one that I do think it is a challenge that air pollution cannot be seen properly unless you are outside of London. So it feels like something that people hear about, but it's not as strongly in your face as it might be if it were, dirty water or something like that. I wonder if there is a political issue around air pollution being the worst in cities across the UK, while at the same time, often they have a Labour leadership and the central government, who is ultimately required to address this at the most effective levels with powers and funds and action, is obviously from the Conservative Party. Another thing that I think is probably a real challenge is that it affects, as Tiffany already outlined, the most marginalized in our society the most. So children, people with lung and heart conditions, people living in poorer communities, and people of color are often the most affected by air pollution. Another point is that women do the school run as well as other short trips, and are thereby perhaps the most affected in a way by realizing how congested roads are at all times, not just at peak times. And generally, it's a topic that's just not popular with national government, because it is also a topic that is not very popular with some of the media and with other communities, because what it really requires is significant funds to clean up the air. Implementing a clean air zone in a big city, installing the cameras, all that kind of stuff really costs money. It's action that impacts drivers, industry, and people burning wood. And all of these are communities that have very, very strong lobbying group fighting for their interests, and that are strongly heard by government in our experience. So I think these are sort of the challenges, some of the main challenges why we are seeing problems, and why the action is not happening as we would have expected. But I would be very keen to hear from others in the chat what you think, what the issues are. Anyway, I'm coming to the end. Just two pictures here of the kind of work we've done. One is on social media, and the other is sort of flyers we've done to be campaign very positively. And well, thank you so much for having me here in this forum and to speak about air pollution and the kind of work we do as a group of parents, but primarily as mums, to be completely honest. And I look forward to hearing the other presenters speak some more. And yeah, and lastly, please get in touch. We're always keen to collaborate, learn, or do other things where we can reach other people, share the message about air pollution, and create a bigger movement towards change.
Thanks, Jemima. And I think certainly as a Bristol MP, yeah, there's some very good active groups, quite often run by mums as well, and based around schools campaigns. And I know that they've looked to what's being done in London for inspiration and ideas. And I think I can say, without getting too political, we did certainly feel as a city that once the government had lost the Client Earth case, it was very much a case of passing the buck down to local authorities to act, and not necessarily passing the powers and resources at the same time. But as I said, I'm here as the chair rather than to sort of make political points. But we've now got Emma, who is going to talk about the WI's recent report highlighting the impact of cuts to bus services on women and people living in rural areas, looking at things like the impact on social exclusion, mental health, and so on. So over to you, Emma. Oh, you need to unmute.
There we go. Hopefully you should be able to hear me now, and hopefully you should be able to see my PowerPoint as well. Thank you so much for the introduction, Kerry, and to Women's Budget Group and Women's Environment Network for inviting us today. We're really happy to be discussing these issues with you all, and it's been really interesting to hear the previous two speakers. So much overlap with what we have found in the course of our research. So just to kind of talk you through the WI, I know we're maybe not always known as a campaigning organisation, but we are the largest voluntary women's organisation in the UK. We have about 200,000 members in 6,000 WIs. That's across England, Wales and the islands. And we've been campaigning pretty much since the word go. So we're coming up on our 106th anniversary this September. And we've been campaigning pretty much from the start. And actually, we've been working on things like public transport for a very long time, sort of through the years. I suppose what's unique about our model is that we are a very democratic organisation. So all of our campaigning work stems directly from the views and experiences of WI members and their communities kind of across our network. And that is where our Get On Board campaign came from as well. So we have an annual resolution process, which means that any WI member who is concerned about an issue can bring that issue to their WI, and it can be put forward as a resolution submission for discussion by the national body. And those that are successful then become adopted as WI policy. And the reason I mention that is that in 2019, we started looking at buses. We get anything up to kind of 60 to 100 resolutions each year. That year we had 7 different resolutions, all about bus cuts from across the country. So it was kind of a little red warning light, I think, for us at the National Federation, just kind of thinking, actually, this is clearly something that is affecting members in their own lives. And one of those resolutions went forward to our annual meeting, was adopted by the WI and became WI policy. And that resolution was really essentially calling for bus services to be made sustainable. So both in terms of kind of funding, organisation, both for social inclusion reasons and also for environmental reasons. So that resolution has become the basis of our Get On Board campaign, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about today. Just going to try and move my slide on. Yeah, so our campaign, so we launched it in 2019, and I suppose we've just come from the perspective that actually, bus services are important for getting it to from A to B, of course, accessing employment, education, local facilities and health services. But actually, we think that they play a much bigger role, both in making our communities sustainable and actually also reducing things like social isolation and mental illness. So those are sort of the kind of cornerstones, I suppose, of our WI campaign since we launched it. So we launched the campaign in 2019 and we just had this tremendous kind of groundswell of support from WI members. So over 140 of them got in touch with us. I think there was kind of a lot of kind of pent up feedback that they wanted to get across and just felt like this was a kind of hidden issue. So 140 members actually got in touch with us directly to share what are often, really distressing experiences, detailed case studies about the impact of generally, unfortunately, the loss of bus services in their own communities. And that was impacts on them as individuals, but also the kind of wider community impacts, what that's meant for their often rural communities and the negative impacts. We had some that were, where communities had to step up and run their own bus services, and a kind of general theme, I would say, of not really feeling listened to. So when changes were being proposed, communities just were not at the heart of that. Things were being done to them, services were being removed, and they felt very kind of powerless to make those changes. So then we decided to do some sort of more in-depth research. So we did a survey to gather kind of a broader range of experiences. We had 2,500 people completed that. Vast majority of those were women. It was open inside and outside the WI network, so it's experiences for members and non-members. And the findings from that formed our report, which you can see there on the slide on the left. And so I just thought I would talk you through some of the kind of key findings of that report. You can access it on our website, and I've got the link at the end of the PowerPoint. So where do we start? I mean, unfortunately and possibly predictably, the picture we gathered from the survey was largely one of cuts to services, unfortunately. So it was almost half of those who actually responded to us said that their local bus service had reduced or stopped altogether in the last 3 years. And 41% of them were telling us that actually that had negatively impacted their access to what I would, I think we would all regard as the absolute bread and butter services that you need to access to carry out your day-to-day life, whether that's work, education, caring responsibilities, volunteering. And I've just put one of our case studies up here. So this is a member who shared her experiences. She's, their bus service had been cut. She's got a 6-mile round trip to access something like the bank and to the local shops. There is one bus service, which is 10 minutes away to get to the doctors. But obviously, with only one bus per hour, I'm sure we all know what it's like trying to get a doctor's appointment at the moment. It's very, very difficult just to plan basic access to healthcare. So some really kind of negative impacts that we found from our research. We also found that these impacts were particularly acute, as you probably might expect, for those who were living in rural areas. So only 1 in 5 people living in rural areas said that they had access to a frequent, reliable bus service. So actually the vast, vast majority of people just did not have access to something that they could make good use of. 46% said that their access to basic services had been negatively impacted by a reduction in bus services, and 37% said their access to health services had been negatively affected. So again, just making it that bit harder for people to access these basics of life. And again, we saw some really kind of worrying impacts on mental health and isolation. I think this really brought home to us, I suppose, the loss of bus services doesn't just impact your kind of ability to carry out that bread and butter everyday tasks. It has a ripple effect on what I would say is kind of the health and well-being of the entire community. Buses play a role far beyond just getting people from A to B. So 19% of people who lived in a rural area told us that a reduction in bus services had negatively impacted their mental health. It's 1 in 5 people mental health impacted. That's really concerning. And those in rural areas who had lost their services were really impacted, both in terms of actually just not being able to make journeys. So 13% of people said to us, I can't make my journey now, there is no bus service. So actually, what are those people missing out on? How are they accessing food, banking, health services if they are unable to make those journeys? And again, over 1 in 10, so 12%, said to us that they leave the house less frequently. That can only compound a sense of social isolation that people may be experiencing if they're just not able to get out of their house as they would have done. So really concerning findings, I think, on that front. And again, I've just included a story here from someone who shared their experience as a vulnerable autistic person, relying on the bus service for their independence in terms of finding work and voluntary work, but also that social isolation point, and recognizing that those who also use the buses in their community are going to face that isolation if services are removed. So then I think this is very much kind of similar to some of the things that Tiffany was talking about. We just had a running theme in the research that existing bus services are just not meeting the needs of women. So we know that women are much more likely than men to have things like caregiving responsibilities, more likely to be in part-time work, and again, much more likely to need to take, for example, multiple short journeys, so dropping off kids at school, maybe going to work, going to check on older parents, and then maybe doing the whole thing in reverse at a different point in the day. And our current transport system just does not support that. It's very much kind of a sort of wheel and spoke model aimed at getting people in and out of big cities around the 9 to 5. And the feedback we had from those who took part in the survey is that this just does not work for them. So one person telling us it's not possible for a bus service to get me to different places of work and look after my elderly parents. And very, very many people telling us, actually, I moved to this place. I started using the bus service. I took on a job because it would fit around the existing bus service, only to find that those services either were cut to the bone, and therefore they had real struggles getting to work, or it was not reliable enough, so they've had to be forced to take other measures and try to get to work. So real difficulties, I suppose, in terms of meeting women's particular needs around what we want from the transport system. And just to continue on that topic, I suppose, we also had quite a number of people express to us in the comment boxes, actually, that they just had no evening bus services. And this is clearly a problem for anyone who is working. If you look at work, for example, anyone who's working outside of a 9 to 5. But actually, we had very many people talk to us about not being able to access what I would call community life because there were no bus services. So access to leisure, access to education, you know, many WI members saying, actually, yes, I moved to this area, the bus service was cut. I actually can't get to my WI meeting. I can't meet up with my friends. I have to rely on someone to pick me up and take me there now because the service that was once there is now gone. So that's clearly a big problem that we're facing. And again, I can think tapping into some of the stats that Tiffany mentioned, this feeling of not feeling comfortable to use transport in the evenings, not feeling safe, not feeling that the facilities are there and available for people to use. So really quite shocking statistics around not feeling comfortable to use evening bus services. And we just found that that's significantly affecting those who work perhaps unusual shift patterns or who just don't do what I would call a kind of traditional 9 to 5. And yeah, people telling us we've never had an evening bus service, or we've not had one for very many years. So clearly there is a job to do around actually what does the transport planning look like so that it meets women's needs. And so that is really a whistle-stop tour, I suppose, across our kind of findings from our research. And I think it was really obvious to us in terms of putting the report together that bus services at the moment are just not meeting the needs of their communities that they're supposed to be serving, and particularly not meeting the needs of women. And we must see changes in order to make these work and to make our communities both kind of sustainable and viable. And I just wanted to kind of leave you with this, again, another story that members have shared with us about just what the bus service means to them. So she said, many people, including me, rely on the bus service for shopping, but also for the regular company and banter at the bus stop. I moved here 6 years ago after my husband died, and along with the friendly people I met at our local WI, it is the social contact and interaction with those who use the bus services that I have valued and enjoyed. I fear this community will be lost with the dramatic reduction in services. And I think that kind of puts it better than I ever could, just kind of what a role bus services can play and should be playing in our communities. And so I would be really interested to kind of join the debate with you after this to find out how we can develop some solutions, I suppose. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Emma. Again, I think that's research that bears out what many of us already were worried was the case. And I think the challenge is how we translate that into policy action and funding commitments and so on. We've got some questions. We're a little push for time. We've got about 15 minutes left. We've had 4 questions so far that have been posted in the Q&A. And if you had been posting anything in the chat, could you please put it in the Q&A box, because that's the one that I get to see. Just to make clear that this is being recorded, so people will be able to watch it back if they want to have another look through. A lot of information on the slides, and the links to the reports have also been included in the chat box. So in terms of the questions, I think perhaps given the time, if people could just, the people on the panel could just choose which one they sort of feel that they, rather than me trying to bring in everybody on everything, if people could sort of just indicate, the panelists could indicate if it's something they want to answer. But the first one is about idling. I think actually we linked the first two because they're both about air pollution, and I think particularly around schools. One of the attendees says she finds it intimidating to ask people to turn their engines off if they are idling, and says it should be tackled by legislation and parking attendants, but she knows it's already worth a fixed penalty notice. So what could we do to actually, change people's behaviour? Does it need a stronger enforcement, or is there more that can be done to actually encourage people to behave themselves better? And then the other one that's about pollution around schools, who have to dash to get to work on time. And I think we all know that scenario, particularly if people have got kids at different schools, and sometimes it's like dropping one child off at nursery, dropping another one off at primary school, and then having to get into town to go to work, and because buses just aren't available. So what would be the answer on that? I guess, seeing as you're the air pollution campaigner, Jemima, did you want to come in on those?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you. So on the idling, I totally agree. There's two things that need to happen. One is that government needs to sort out the whole system. Currently, local councils don't have any reason to really enforce it because it is so complicated to enforce. So that is why it isn't enforced properly. But that is one thing that we're going to do a wider idling campaign to national government to sort out the legislation. But in the meanwhile, I totally agree. I find it very intimidating to speak to people about idling. So what we've done at Mums for Lungs in response to that feeling of intimidation is a flyer, and you can order it off our Twitter page or just email me mumsforlungs@gmail.com, sorry, and you can just hand over that flyer, and that sort of saves you the discussion. I just walk up to people and say, hi, can I just hand you this? They think whatever it is. I then walk away, say thanks, and the engine always is turned off. But I don't have to say a word about idling or all of that patronizing stuff that can be patronizing is sort of taken away. The other thing is around the school streets. I totally know about the difficulties of taking children to school and making it all work in the morning. So when school streets are introduced, the first thing I want to say, it is usually not a very big area, right? We're talking about the school right in the road right in front of the school that is closed off. So you don't have a very long walk to the school if you need to park somewhere nearby and then walk across. But we also have seen that people are very willing and very keen to collaborate and help other parents getting their children to school safely. So often when you do have a discussion starting in the school around air pollution and school streets, that is really a good opportunity for people to get together and say, you know what, I live nearby you, I'll take your kid to school on that day, you take the kids on another day. Or you could even meet people at the end of the road where by the closed road, and they will walk your children down. So we've seen that actually school street, especially if enforced through bollards, creates a real opportunity for people to get in touch and talk to each other and then sort out these things like that really pragmatically. And people have met in a new way, because you're not standing on the pavement worried about your children getting run over, but you're actually in a much more informal atmosphere where you can speak to others.
Brilliant, thanks. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip straight to the next questions. There's a couple that are particularly directed at Tiffany. One says, I wonder if Tiffany could elaborate a bit more on how public ownership would work. Is this intended to address the gaps between central government funding and what the public transport system actually needs? And the other one is asking a more specific question about the bystander intervention training point, and they're worried that it is a bit of a big society cop-out. So that's a specific recommendation or specific point made in the report. So Tiffany.
Sure. So on the first question about public ownership is really just a mechanism to increase accountability to the public. And currently, the profit incentive is the main motivation for which bus services exist or don't exist. And bringing buses back into public ownership would give local authorities the control over service provision, so routes, frequency, cost, and accessibility. And I guess it raises a broader question around devolution, specifically fiscal devolution, and ensuring that local authorities have the powers and financial resources to do these types of things. And then the point about bystander intervention training, I think that's a good question. I suppose the issue with just staff is it's not only about increasing staffing or ensuring adequate staffing, it's ensuring that staff are trained to deal with gender-based violence and other types of hate crimes in public space. Staff may not always seem approachable, for instance, for immigrants or asylum seekers who may be worried about encounters with police and law enforcement. They may be hesitant to approach staff for help with street harassment or other issues like that. So bystander intervention is really a recommendation for a more community-based approach rather than more policing. And I agree that there are aspects of spatial design that can be changed to increase perceptions and experiences of safety. Staffing also plays a role, but I think where the biggest problem lies is cultural change and creating a culture of public accountability so that there is no tolerance for street harassment and that we as a society feel like we can call it out and stop it from escalating or even happening.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that came up in the roundtables that I ran was that you have to remember that quite often, although we've seen the figures on how many women work in transport, but yeah, it might well be that a bus driver or the station staff are female themselves, and they might be the ones that are being the victims of harassment or being put in danger. So there's the question about they're not necessarily the people to be reporting it to. They might be the victims or caught up in it as well. So I should just also on in terms of the work that's been done on the safety side, I did have a meeting with my opposite number, the Minister Rachel McLean, on Monday, and it's all a bit vague, the stuff that is being suggested at the moment, but the government is sort of very much telling me that it's working on these issues and keen to consider proposals and to look at the planning system and all those issues as well. So I think the more pressure that we can put on the government to say, well, bring forward your ideas, the better. So Emma, I didn't know if you wanted to address anything that we mentioned so far, but there's also a question about buses, saying has anyone done the maths as to what improvements could be made to buses if the monies that's being spent on HS2 were reallocated to them?
Yeah, I mean, I just want, I suppose, just to kind of pick up on the bystander training point. I mean, I think it's a broader point, isn't it? Women have to feel safe going about their everyday lives, and you know, like many organisations, I'm sure who are here today, we work on violence against women, and I just think without that culture permeates every aspect of women's lives, doesn't it? And so we actually have to have a bigger societal change, I think, if we're going to kind of tackle things like safety on public transport. In terms of doing the maths, that is not something I've done. And at the WI, we're not working on HS2. We don't have a mandate on that. But it was interesting. One of the areas I didn't cover in our report was just the kind of so much feedback we got from people who said our transport is not integrated. You know, yes, I can get the train, but there is no bus to get me to the train station, or I could get back on the train and there is no bus to get me home. So I think there's just a kind of broader point, which is, you know, yes, we at the WI are advocating for bus services, but actually if our transport system is not properly integrated, then the system doesn't work. And we just had, absolutely tons and tons of feedback that the train is not joined up with the bus, or the cycle lane doesn't exist to get you to the train station. So I think there's lots more to do on that point. I know it's not really answering your question, but clearly there is a big hole there, I think.
Yeah, and there's one final question in the chat from Kerry, from, I think she said elsewhere, was from TSSA, and there's some very reform changes coming forward at the moment. She says if this translates, I'm assuming it's a woman, are men called Kerry, but I'm assuming it's a woman. If the rail reform changes translate into staffing cuts, how can we make the case for safe green public transport options with visible staffing and not behind the scenes resourcing to plan effectively with campaigners and trade unions? I don't know who wants to tackle this. It covers a few of the issues that we've already mentioned when talking about the bystander point, I guess, about the need for staffing to actually be central to this. I don't know if it's something that was in terms of what was in the report, Tiffany, you wanted to comment on.
I will just make a point about working with trade unions which is that in the report, there is a brief discussion of how investments in active travel infrastructure and public transport would create a lot of good green jobs. And it's really important that in the transition to low carbon transport systems, that workers are also part of the discussion, and that there will be fair, well-paid, secure work for people who work in walking, cycling, public transport. And there's a huge potential for just really good green job creation. So I think it seems really essential to not only emphasize the need for active travel infrastructure and public transport to be considered and treated as essential services in the pandemic recovery, but also to emphasize just the fact that it can really play a part in leveling up as well, not only in improving connectivity for people, but just job creation.
Yeah, and I think we shouldn't forget it's been a really difficult year for public transport workers, partly in terms of people not using the services and perhaps people being laid off, but also just in terms of the risk with COVID and just having to enforce regulations, sometimes with people who are quite resistant to that. So we're drawing to a close now. I want to thank everybody for attending, particularly the three speakers, Tiffany, Jemima and Emma. As has been said, the links to the reports are in the chat. This is being recorded so people can watch it back. Anna's just posted in the chat, there's more that can, as well as reading the report, you can find out more about the Feminist Green New Deal project and upcoming events here. I think the next event is in the autumn and is about local communities, so which sounds like a very interesting one as well. And there's also a link to what the Women's Environmental Network has been doing on the Feminist Green New Deal. I think I would very much hope that this is part of an ongoing discussion, because as I said, there's too many male voices in transport, and as we said right at the start, too many of them are interested in things like rail gauges and the latest in sustainable aviation fuel technology, and that's all really, really important. But at the end of the day, a lot of it does come down to how can a mum drop her kids off at school and get to work and not have to breathe in hideous fumes at the same time, and just how people's lives stack up and how they can do it safely and without being harassed, and how they can afford to do it as well. So this is all right. Kerry's just confirmed she's a female, Kerry. I thought she probably would be, but so thanks all for coming, and hopefully some people will be able to come along to the next one as well. Thanks a lot, and thanks to Women's Budget Group for organising this. Thank you. I think that's it. Okay, bye-bye everybody.